The night was clear, the moonlight brightening the cistern where three young boys cleared out a coffee pot. Suddenly, a different light approached, a transparent orb, inside of which were four strange beings. This orb cast out two beams of light, and one of the strange entities descended right near the boys. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am just another tinfoil hat. Welcome to my show. Now, you'll see my background's a little bit different. Genuinely considering the multicolored strings idea. I actually was toying with that. That is definitely the vibe that I'm going for. You know, the crazy Fox Mulder conspiracy, corkboard type feel. So stay tuned. Maybe I'll add those. Maybe not. I don't want it to get too busy. There are a few things that I'm looking through for my collection that I'm probably going to add to the background, so that's why there's still some empty space. But thank you everyone who gave me your input. So today, without further ado, we will be discussing the fascinating case of the flying saucer Cyclops. Now, this case occurred the evening of August 28th, 1963, near Belo Horizonte, Brazil. It involved three boys, Fernando Gilberto, 12, his brother Ronaldo, 7, and their friend and neighbor, Jose Marcos Vidal, also 7. Right after supper, around 10 minutes to 8 o'clock, the three boys were sent out to clean out a coffee filter or coffee pot in a water drum located next to a cistern in the backyard of the Gilberto home. The night was well illuminated by the moon, although as Jose Marcos went out to the cistern, Ronaldo realized that the outside seemed extremely bright, even for such a clear night with a pretty, near full moon. Upon looking up, he and his brother realized that this was actually due to this well-lit, transparent, spherical object, which had also some sort of triangular antenna kind of on it that was floating over a nearby avocado tree. Now, inside of this object, the two boys noticed four rows of beings, each sitting in like one-legged chairs or one-legged stools. It sounds very very spacey Star Trekky kind of. Now, they all appeared similar, though with slight variations. They believed that one was a female being due to the fact that it had long hair brushed back in kind of a ponytail. One appeared to be extremely muscular. The one at the front of the object appeared to be controlling what they described as an instrument panel, which looked something like a TV. Now, as the two boys were watching this bizarre scene, the third boy, Jose Marcos, was just absolutely preoccupied with filling the water bucket and cleaning the coffee filter, so he didn't even notice this bizarre luminous object floating overhead, even as it cast out two beams of yellow light, which stretched to the ground. Now, what's more, one of these entities apparently exited the craft and started descending to the ground on the beams of light. The boys, including Jose Marcos, who even though he didn't see the being when it was first descending on these beams of light, but saw it shortly thereafterwards, described this entity as standing about 2 meters or 6.5 feet tall, wearing a bizarre shiny leather diving suit with kind of a folded or corrugated texture on certain parts of it, and the whole thing was topped with a clear kind of bubble helmet. Now, through this helmet, they saw that the being was bald in kind of this reddish-orange color. But perhaps oddest of all, they claimed that the being had one eye in the center of its forehead, as well as rather human-looking teeth, with the exception of two very large, sharp teeth at each corner, one pointing up and one pointing down. Now, they claimed that the single eye did not have any whites, and the pupil appeared simply as a darker bar in the center of what we can assume is the iris. He seemed to have some sort of copper-colored box on the back of his outfit. So after this bizarre being landed, again, kind of drifting down almost as though the beams of light were some sort of bizarre elevator, it began walking towards the cistern and Jose Marcos, who again by this point was just completely oblivious to the bizarre craft, the strange beings, the whole thing. Just again, super focused on the coffee pot or coffee filter, whatever it was. I mean, hey, I love coffee too, so I understand. The witnesses described this being's gait as stiff and clumsy, almost like its arms and legs were stuck in this kind of rigid open position, and it swayed back and forth as it moved. Now, when it reached the cistern, they claimed that it kind of reached for Jose Marcos, and Fernando, taking this as some sort of effort to abduct the young boy, immediately jumped over and kind of pulled him to the ground and away from this strange being. Now, the entity then finally took notice of Ronaldo, who at this point was trying to creep back to the safety of the house. The strange visitor began making weird gestures with its hands and speaking in a deep gibberish that the boys thought may have been laughter. Kind of creepy. Now, all three boys claimed to be so frightened that they felt they were just unable to make a run for it, though Fernando would soon find the courage to do something else. The being eventually took a seat on a rock near the cistern with its back to the witnesses, and it was at this stage that Fernando picked up a piece of brick with the intention to throw it and hit the strange entity, hopefully breaking the helmet just to see what would happen. I mean, he was curious and, also probably a little frightened. As soon as he raised his arm to throw the brick, however, the being jumped to its feet and immediately turned towards Fernando, when suddenly a band of yellow light, much like that which came from the craft, came from an opening in the being's chest. This yellow light kind of stretched and made contact with Fernando's arm, which immediately lost strength. He just dropped the brick and couldn't move his arm. At this point, the being looked up at his craft and began making these kind of circular gestures. It moved away from the boys, and one of them asked if it would return, at which point it turned and nodded gravely, they say. The bands of light returned from the object and retrieved the being, which ascended into the craft as gracefully as it had descended from it. Now, when this entity made it into the object, the light became more intense, and it began slowly ascending into the sky. Now, suddenly there was a flash of light, and then the object went dark before finally vanishing behind a roof. When it totally vanished, they claimed that a gust of wind kind of came out of nowhere. Now, by this point, the boys said that they were no longer afraid of the strange being, thinking that it had not come to hurt them or with any ill intentions, and that it would probably return someday. Now, however, as in many of these cases, the sensation of calm did not last long. Suddenly, the spell was broken, and all three boys ran screaming back into the house. I don't know what became of the coffee pot or coffee filter that was taken with them or left there. Who knows? They ran back to the house, calling for Fernando and Ronaldo's mother, who actually, in the minutes previous, claimed that she had noticed a flash of light out the window and didn't really know what it was from. It was in an area that wouldn't have had cars or headlights or anything like that in it. She had never noticed something like that before, but she didn't really think much of it until the boys came inside so frightened that immediately Jose Marcos actually hid under a bed, and in the weeks following the incident, all three refused to go outside after dark. Now, in addition to this, there were a few other sightings of bizarre illuminated kind of windowed objects in the area, and there were strange triangular marks left in the garden, which were uncovered the next day. Now, this is a fantastic, funky case that really checks all the boxes for my favorite humanoid encounters. What I love is that you have some very kind of space age iconography, some very kind of standard to mid-century sightings aspects of this encounter. The diving suit, even the corrugated texture is something we see time and time again, the clear dome-like helmet, and then just the total outlier of this thing being a freaking Cyclops. Interestingly enough, kind of on the flip side of the beliefs, you have this kind of space alien type sighting of these bizarre entities flying around in some sort of craft, but on the flip side of that kind of, future-oriented belief system, if we look into Brazilian folklore, there is a precedent for bizarre one-eyed beings, the Mapinguari. Now, debates currently rage over this creepy creature, though if you go by the traditional folklore, it dictates that this is the result of a shaman who was cursed by the gods. Now, although bearing a lot of similarities to Bigfoot and also having some very interesting outliers from Bigfoot, such as having backward-facing feet, something I've mentioned a few times actually that's really common across different folkloric entities, and also having a mouth in its torso, a little less common across folkloric entities, I find it very interesting that this absolute pillar of Brazilian folklore shares its one-eyed countenance and also its coloring. The Mapinguari is said to be covered in this kind of reddish-orange hair with these hairless beings, again, one-eyed and supposedly this reddish-orange in color. Again, I absolutely love finding these connections to kind of older belief systems and older folklore kind of reinventing itself in the modern age of the UFO sightings. Yet again, in this case, kind of in line with the proto-entity theory of Paul Devereaux, you have this very strong iconographical tie between the craft and the entities as it pertains to this clear dome. The craft was a clear sphere, the beings were a clear dome-like helmet. Also, you have this bizarre kind of beam of light, which appeared the same whether it was coming from the craft or the entity. Also, on the topic of bizarre lights, you have light just absolutely punctuating kind of every escalation of this encounter. At the beginning, the boys notice this luminescent thing. The luminescent thing then shoots lights down, and a being descends and is closer to them. And then finally, when the entire event ends, you have this object gaining luminosity and then kind of flashing before going dim and vanishing. Now, another kind of aspect of this encounter, which I think is really neat, is this gust of wind, which was described. And this is another commonality between many UFO encounters that stretches back to much older folklore. Whether fairies, jinn, ghosts, you name it, you have all of these anomalous entities connected to these bizarre, seemingly sourceless gusts of wind. Now, this case also details something which I find of just absolute interest and I think is sometimes overlooked, and that is response. The response of the witnesses as well as the response of the entities. So, the first thing that I'd like to cover is kind of this bizarre calm. I mean, we've noticed this in many other paranormal encounters where people are like, just, they're witnessing something out of the ordinary, something which typically, even if it was something mundane but out of the ordinary, we would react with some sort of, if not fear, at least wariness. And the boys do have that initially, this fear of this object, the being descending from the object. However, at a certain point in this encounter, it's swapped to just absolute calm. And again, that switch, when it seems as though some sort of spell is broken and they react with fear again, makes it seem to me like some sort of, actual condition of the experience, as opposed to just, a coincidence that so many people who experience the paranormal also experience this almost apathy to what they're experiencing. I mean, how many encounters have you heard where people are witnessing Bigfoot, witnessing ghostly phenomena, witnessing a UFO, and they decide to go back to bed? But the other side of this coin is the response of the entities. Now, this case has two really interesting aspects of entity response. The first being that when Fernando was going to throw the brick at the being, it immediately turned, looked at him, and cast out this beam of light which paralyzed his arm. Now, the beam of light itself is very interesting. It reminds me of the infamous spring-heeled Jack, who is said to have a lantern kind of set into its chest, or another almost contemporary of the spring-heeled Jack, the Van Meter Visitor, this bizarre winged beast which was said to exude a paralyzing mist as well as having a single kind of light source in the center of its head. But beyond that, this immediate response, which we also see when, I believe it was Jose Marcos, asks if the creature is going to come back, it turns and nods. To me, this response seems so instantaneous that I believe it really shows more of a connection between the observer and the observed than an actual response. I mean, are we to assume that, this Cyclopean creature had another eye in the back of its head so that it could see when Fernando was going to throw a brick at it and immediately just jumped up and, paralyzed him? I think that, again, the instantaneous nature of so many of these sightings, or the perfect timing nature, I've discussed that before, especially in the case of the Winterfold Wonder, where these people saw this absolutely bizarre kind of, not to use a Lovecraftian term, but indescribable thing as they were driving. So often these encounters happen at exactly the perfect time. And here, in this kind of idea of the being responding so instantaneously, I think it really does show that these beings are much more connected to us, our thoughts, our minds, than separated from us. Well, if you enjoyed this episode on the flying saucer Cyclops, please like, and if you're new to this field of crop circles, go ahead and subscribe to see what weirdness the future may have in store. Till then, you can keep up with me on my free blog at patreon.com/justanothertinfoilhat. And for today, I am Zelia Edgar, signing off.
Doing.